I really couldn't be more pleased to be joined this evening by my old friend and comrade. We have Simon Jackson, who has come all the way from the shining metropolis of Calgary, Alberta, to join us for a pair of events that we're organizing around this theme of energy, environment, and national unity this evening and tomorrow at the Victoria Forum, taking place this year at Royal Roads University. So Simon, who will have a chance to speak and say a little bit more about himself in a moment, was kind enough to make space in his busy schedule to come and to participate at my request, because there really was no one who came to mind for me quite the way Simon did in terms of having, I would say, a unique vantage point on these issues that are so fundamental to what's happening right now in Canadian politics, and certainly are very live here in our local politics. So Simon will say more about his background in a moment, but what I would just like to share with you before I turn over the microphone is that Simon and I have been friends for over 20 years, which is a shocking thing to say, but it's true. So we are in fact old friends. And Simon is also somebody who is deeply experienced in the Canadian environmental movement from an advocacy and activist perspective, but also today as an environmental educator, really. And so has a number of different perspectives, and is also originally a British Columbian who has, in around the last 10 years or so, migrated over the mountains to Alberta. So he's also very well positioned to speak to both provinces' perhaps distinct perspectives on these issues. British Columbia, where he has long roots in the environmental and climate movements, and Alberta, where of course there are folks who see these issues a little bit differently than some of our fellow residents and constituents here in Victoria. So no one that I was more eager to have this conversation with than Simon. He'll be joining tomorrow at Victoria Forum as the moderator on a panelist full of MPs. I'm calling it a multi-party panel on energy, environment, and national unity. If anybody's available to attend the Victoria Forum, it should be an interesting conversation. We do have several local members of Parliament, yours truly included, but we have Elizabeth May joining us. We have Gord Johns from the Middle Island, the Alberni riding, joining us, as well as my colleague MP Matt Generou, who represents a riding in Edmonton, Riverbend. And so we have both British Columbia and Albertan perspectives, and we have multi-partisan perspectives on these issues. So I'm excited for the conversation tomorrow, but tonight we have Simon all to ourselves, and only one MP for him to worry about. So Simon, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for making the effort, truly. And why don't you introduce yourself to the folks and say a few words, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. It's good to be home, I gotta say. BC is home. It's you never lose your British Columbianness of you, and it's good to see friends. It's good to be home. So thank you for bringing me here. I do have to admit to you all, though, I feel badly. I am not a partisan. I am not an uppercase liberal, and I realize this is largely a partisan liberal event. But in my current work, I am a nonpartisan human. So I can't take positions on issues or in politics like my friend Will can, but I can still be a good friend to my friends, and Will is nothing if not one of my closest friends. And the least I can do for him is to help come out and talk about some really important issues, I think, at a really important juncture in our country's history. Some of you know I have a long past. I might be young still, or at least I think I'm still young, but I have a long past. So as some of you know, my journey really goes back to when I was 7 years old. And I always say that my parents, the greatest gifts they ever gave me was the gift of news and the gift of travel. And we couldn't, at that time, we couldn't afford exotic trips, and news was still readily available on TV, thankfully. And so I had the opportunity to go traveling with them. There was one time we were on a family camping trip to Yellowstone National Park that I saw a grizzly bear mother with 2 cubs. And who knows why one moment captures the imagination of a young person, but for me, that was the moment that captured my imagination and sparked a passion for bears. And so it became that I went home and I wanted to learn everything there was to know about bears. And one evening on the news, I saw a story about Alaska's Kodiak bears and plans being drawn up to develop their home. And I decided I wanted to do something that seemed like an assault on those same bears I had seen on my camping trip. So I decided to do what any 7-year-old would do and have a lemonade stand. And I drew pictures of bears and sold lemonade all summer long, and you can only imagine, and some of you know who she is, my mother, how much money she spent buying that lemonade. But I raised $60, wrote to Prime Minister Mulroney and President Bush Sr., and a few months later a letter came back in the mail saying that the Kodiak bear was going to be saved. And I thought, yes, I did it! And obviously, I had nothing to do with it whatsoever, but it planted that seed that I could make a difference. And I think that is probably the most important lesson that I ever learned. And I'm sure you would agree was a lesson that you learned at one point as well, that one person, no matter what their age, can make a difference for all life. And it was an idea I took with me while growing up. I got involved with other issues to help bears. And when I turned 13 and I learned about the white Kermode bear, or spirit bear, on Canada's west coast, I wanted to get involved to help give it a voice, because I was stunned to learn that its future was far from secure. And of course, the answer of what to do, again, was pretty obvious. It was take the issue to my school, talk to my peers, and see if I could get students in my school to get involved. And at the time, I was very shy, I hated public speaking, I had a stutter, but I knew if I overcame my fear, I could try to get the message out. And by the end of the day, everybody in my school wrote a letter. 700 letters were mailed to then Premier Glenn Clark, and a few months later, a letter came back in the mail basically saying, thanks so much for your interest, but yeah, not gonna happen. And it was a formal letter to boot! I said 4 letters. And I was shocked. It was that sort of first real setback that kind of rocked my childhood naivety. But I didn't give up, and I realized it just required a lot more focus and a lot more learning. And part of that learning was picking up a copy of the telephone book, because of course there was no Google then, which really does date me. And I started calling different people who I thought would have some view on this issue. And with time I started connecting with many people, but including 2 legitimate Canadian heroes in the room tonight, Karen McAllister and Barbara Murray, who are great advocates for the environment and great advocates for our coast. And the McAllisters, along with Wayne McRory and so many other people who maybe names you know of from environmental campaigns of the past in this province, gave me so much time to teach me and to mentor me and to bring me into this issue. And I spent most of my high school life trying to give voice to this bear. And it involved carrying a slide projector machine to schools all around the Lower Mainland, traveling buses all the way out to Langley, and it was a slow build. But we were trying to show the world that this bear existed, that it deserved a voice, and that its future was far from secure. The campaign evolved with time. It involved crazy things like trying to get Prince William's attention one day at a public event, to one day getting the Backstreet Boys involved. But with time, it grew and grew and grew and got more credibility. And slowly we amassed a network of more than 6 million young people. Prince Harry was there too, but he was less enthusiastic, shall we say. But we amassed a network of more than 6 million young people around the world to speak up for the spirit bear. And of course, I'm fast forwarding through a lot of things that happened, the ups and the downs, and I'm happy to get into it because I think a lot of that is relevant to some of the conversations we're having today. But ultimately, 20 years later, what we set out to achieve in protecting the last intact habitat of the spirit bear in full, connected in an interconnected way to other protected areas, helped lead to one of the largest land protection measures in North American history, and truly what is now one of the bright spots of biodiversity. When we look around the world today and all that's happening, especially south of the border, this is one of the things we can look to and say, this is real hope. This is that bulwark for biodiversity. And it was achieved by so many different people working together, putting aside their differences, their partisanship, and finding ways to create solutions in a way that is truly Canadian. And I think it is held up to the test of time. In fact, it's something that I think grows stronger with every single day. But young people were at the heart of that. Young people helped give that bear a voice, helped drive that issue, helped it cross the finish line. And I think what made me the most proud at the end of the day was I recognized at one point that I had become disservice to the cause, that I had become polarizing, and I was part of the problem. And I was becoming upset and angry and hurt, and all those emotions that we have in issues when you stick at something for a very long time. You know this well, I know. And I recognized that at some point I wanted to accomplish what I set out to achieve. I had to recognize maybe the best thing that I could do was take a step back and wrap up that organization that I founded, the Spirit Bear Youth Coalition, and trust that if it was a true movement, then the movement would speak for itself. You didn't need someone orchestrating. And a lot of those young people kept giving their voice to that bear, and that's ultimately what did carried across the finish line. So when I say young people, I don't mean me, but I mean all those people who wrote a letter and stayed involved and kept giving their voice time and time again until that habitat was finally protected. But I'll tell you, from that journey, I didn't walk away feeling particularly good about it, for a host of reasons, and I'm happy to get into it. But one of the things that really struck me was that it was a canary in the coal mine. That if it takes 20 years to protect the spirit bear, something that is relatively intuitive in my opinion at least, that it's going to be much, much harder to protect those lesser lights of our biodiversity. And more importantly, the struggle with that issue and the coast as a whole came down to what I think is a lack of nature literacy in our citizenry, a lack of economic literacy at times, a lack of literacy about our history, particularly Indigenous history, and certainly a lack of democratic literacy and understanding how our institutions work and function. And I left that feeling that if that root cause wasn't addressed, and if every cause takes 20 years to fight, we're never going to get anywhere. And there are too many big issues in this country and around the world that just simply we're going to fall by the wayside. So with some time, I helped co-found a new nonprofit with a project called Nature Labs. And what we're trying to do is tackle that root cause, which is literacy, but in this case, a whole host of issues, and most importantly, democratic. But we're using nature, hence Nature Labs, as the focal point. Because the one thing I did learn from the Spirit Bear campaign was how valuable nature can be as a depoliticized backdoor into some of the thornier issues. Yeah, we get divided on the environment all the time, but nature, the beauty of a sunrise, how majestic a bear can look, fishing for a salmon in a river, that's something I think we can all get at a basic human level, that nature is our common humanity. So we created Nature Labs as Canada's first virtual high school textbook and basically complete learning platform. And we use nature, and particularly the story of two sibling bears who, after being run off by their mother, contrary to what science tells us, have stayed together as a duo, recognizing that, yeah, individually there's two small bears in a big landscape, but together they can accomplish more. One's pretty much your stereotypical male grizzly bear. He's kind of grouchy, he likes the backcountry. The other, she's a bit more of a city girl. And the two of them together are really kind of a perfect metaphor for our times. Alberta and BC, Canada as a whole, and that we really can do more together, and when we try to work together, it's amazing the kind of solutions we can uncover. So we use the story of these two bears to basically bring lessons to life in high school for social studies, science, English, art, careers, and then link that out to the stories of more than 200 Canadians, including your MP here, Dr. Will Greaves, who does a wonderful job of explaining our political system, and as a way to make education more fun, more relevant, but also, more importantly, to get that undercurrent of literacy, nature, economic, democratic systems. How do our systems work? How do young people situate within our systems? Because the one thing that has stunned me in the time since the Youth Coalition has been how young people have changed, how the demographic has changed. While we were the drivers of trying to help give a voice to the spirit bear, now young people increasingly feel absolutely hopeless when it comes to the environment, to the point where they want to go the other direction because they just don't see any point in doing it. And so young people increasingly are the drivers of some of the division and problems we see in our society, which is a huge shift from when I was a kid. But that doesn't mean that they don't care or it's just that they don't understand. So our hope is that by creating education, materials that can help bring classrooms to life for teachers, making their jobs easier, we can raise those literacy levels across the country, and most importantly, make sure that the student in Victoria and the student in St. John's and the student in Pond Inlet are all going to be learning from the same material, so they at least understand and have empathy for those of their neighbors in different parts of this country. Because half the battle, I think, is that we don't know our neighbors. I mean, maybe our literal neighbors, but not our neighbors in my community of Cochrane, Alberta, or our neighbors in Nunavut, right? And so how can we lessen those divides? Well, the wired age gives us that opportunity, and Nature Labs at least is trying to do our part to do that. We've only been online for 2 years. We're working with more than 300,000 high school students in every province and territory in the country. So it's a great start. We've got a lot of work to do, and a big piece that we're doing, a big focus for a cross-curricular piece for our lessons, is focusing on the question. In a cost of living crisis and at a time where our economy is threatened, how do we grow and sustain our economy? How do we sustain and protect our sovereignty? And how do we still find time for those other issues that haven't just gone away, like climate, like biodiversity? And how do we do all that while continuing to keep our country united at a time where we must stay united if we're to overcome the challenges we're facing? That is the question we're putting to them. And as me, I personally don't know if I have the exact answer. Maybe Will's got a few answers, but I know that he's looking for more answers too. But I hope the next generation can be part of that solution and coming up with ideas. So that's the question we're going to have tomorrow. It's the question we're asking through Nature Labs. And obviously it's a conversation we're all having here tonight. So that's a little bit about who I am and where I came from. But it's good to be here. It's good to be home, as I said. So, Will, shall we talk like the old days?
So many good themes there for us to pull on. You know, you and I both have lived in the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. You and I have both worked with young people and tried to educate them about nature, climate, biodiversity, and related issues. We both work with young activists as well. You know, all of these different experiences that we share. The question that I'd like us to maybe get the ball rolling with is, you know, when you reflect back on your time in the environmental movement, your time as an environmental educator, what do you think is different now about the context in which we're trying to make these decisions today around climate, around, you know, our broader relationship with the environment, conservation? What is different about that context today in your mind than when you were maybe more active as a young environmental activist yourself?
It's a good question. And I'll say, I'm sorry that I'm sweating like crazy out here. It's very warm. I also, I probably should give a disclaimer that I'm battling, I'm battling long COVID and have been for the last 4 years. And so I lose control of a lot of aspects of my body. Sweat is one of them. So it just happens. I apologize, but it is what it is. No, it's okay. It's sort of a comfort blanket for me, but I appreciate it. But I think, you know, to answer your question, I think it's a couple of things. I think it's the urgency of the issues, right? I think when I was young, starting out on these issues in the 90s, the future still felt in front of us. We still felt like we had time to tackle these things. But everything seems to be spinning a bit out of control now, right? I mean, it's been said many times, and I'm not breaking new ground by saying we're sort of in the era of polycrisis. But it's true. And so now you've got all these compounding problems happening all at once. They all seem overwhelming. They all seem to have needed to be solved yesterday. So I think part of the problem is that we've been kicking the can down the road for way, way too long, and now the bill is due. So how do you pay that bill when, because we've kicked the can down the road, there are so many people who are, I don't know, fed up with the system, feel like it's broken. You know, the Canada is broken lingo. We see it in Alberta, obviously, with the sovereignty movement. I think all of these are reactions to big decisions that got punted, and now the bill has come due. And so I think you've got both all these crises happening at once, at the same time with a society that feels like our democratic institutions are not equipped to solve the problems because they haven't in the past. And part of that stems, as I said earlier, from a lack of literacy and understanding how they work, but also sort of a sense of, I can't do this, and they just shut down. And then I think an extension of that is that young people today, who are often the drivers or at least the pushers of change, and they still are to a degree, but it's not like it was. And since COVID, we've seen this huge slide in the youth demographic, under 25 and particularly under 18, where the demographic is shifting, and it's shifting against a lot of these issues. And instead of being solution makers, it's more like everybody for themselves. Let's save the deck chairs, you know, before we get into the lifeboats. And that's a really tough place to be making solutions. So to me, it's the volume of issues, the urgency of issues, sort of the collapse of faith in the democratic process, and the fact that the people who usually are the drivers of change aren't necessarily driving positive change. And I say that not taking a position on the issues themselves, but in some cases, and a lot of young people who we work with, actively don't believe democracy is a good thing anymore. Embrace things like fascism. That's a real concern and a real problem in that space. Then you add in factors like media, right? Like traditional media was a huge influence in our ability to get the word out. That doesn't exist anymore. We were talking earlier today about sort of the collapse of social media, that it's not the same it was a few years ago. And you add all of these factors together, it becomes a really muddy stew. And so how do you make progress? I don't begrudge people who have to make hard choices, like you, in government, representing people from different backgrounds, who just feel overwhelmed and frustrated and like everything's being lost. No matter how you come at these issues, everyone feels like they're losing. So I think that's what's really different about the times. But that doesn't mean that's an excuse to do nothing, right? And I say a lot, and I say it in Nature Labs a lot, and I've said it a lot in my speeches over the years. But I think the most important tool we have is trying. And trying to make sure people understand how to try effectively is I still think is our most important endeavor. And so that's, I think, the remedy to the problem, as I see it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Simon. What pops to mind for me immediately is both as a professor and then more recently in my interactions with young constituents and young climate activists and people who've engaged me as their MP, is from an educational perspective, I get frustrated because a lot of these young people come in and the language that they're using, both with me, but also in terms of their public campaigns around the issue of climate change, the issue of pollution, environmental damage, they frame it as, well, we have to stop climate change. And that is really old-fashioned language, even in my ear now, because it misunderstands where we're at collectively as a species, as a planet, and as a country in terms of the issue of climate change. And so something that I have found myself doing a lot, in a way that I hope is constructive, in a way that I hope is helping these young people, and I mean young people, I mean 18, 19, 20 years old, is to try to free them from a burden of thinking that they can stop climate change, because they are too young. They were born in this century, and we know that climate change has been a defining problem for decades into the previous century. And so to me, there's a misalignment between the goals that they're actually pursuing and, in a related way, the responsibility and the burden that they take upon themselves to save the world and to save the climate and to stop ecocide and to stop all this destruction. Very, very well intentioned, very, very meaningful actions that they want to take. But frankly, that's too heavy a cross for a 20-year-old to bear. What I use often to make this point when I'm speaking with these people is something that I used a lot in my teaching at the university. The first, perhaps some folks in the room know this, actually before I reveal the answer, I'll put it as a question. Does anybody know where the very first political meeting around climate change took place in the world, and when, as a bonus question? So there were scientific meetings, right? The science of climate change is not new. There were lots of scientific knowledges, but the date at which the high-level political attention on climate change first started might surprise you. Does anybody hazard a guess? 1988. 1988, the government of Canada, led by then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, hosted a meeting in Toronto called the Conference on the Changing Atmosphere. And the document, the kind of outcome document from that conference is a text that I've used to teach, because it has a very, very succinct and clear articulation of the problem of climate change. And in 1988, I was 4 years old. We were 4 years old, Simon, although in different parts of the country at that time, we were not yet friends. And it says in this document that the problem of climate, humanity is conducting a globally uncontrolled experiment whose ultimate impacts are second only to the impacts of nuclear war. That is what, in 1988, this document had to say about climate change. So the idea that a young person born in 2001 or 2002 has a burden to stop climate change is for them to actually assume an impossible burden. And then their feelings of failure when they can't solve this problem that was a crisis before they were even a glimmer in their parents' eye is, I think, actually part of the problem. Not that we shouldn't be ambitious, we have to be ambitious. Not that we shouldn't be seeking to address the impacts of climate change, the root causes of climate change, altering our own behavior in ways that make this natural system more sustainable. We absolutely must be doing that. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that we're doing all of those things in the context of climate change. We don't have the luxury any longer, because of the inaction of previous generations of leaders, frankly, and previous generations of citizens who didn't prioritize this issue. Climate change is here. We are stuck with it. I wish it were available to us to solve that problem. It is not. And that is an important, I think, reframe for young people, but really anybody who's committed to addressing the issue of climate change, to have an understanding of what we're actually trying to do. Solving it would be wonderful. I'm afraid the window for that has long since closed. We are in damage control mode. We are in harm reduction mode. We are in long-term mitigation of some of these most devastating impacts mode. Maybe that's solving climate change. I don't think it is. I think that's coping with climate change. So for young people to beat up on themselves and others for not solving this problem is, to me, in fact, part of the problem with youth climate activists today.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think those two comments are probably go hand in hand, because I think a lack of literacy of understanding the issues, how they work, is part of it, right? And the reality of that, a lot of climate change has already happened, will continue to happen no matter what we do, is an absolute realism. But if you don't understand how natural systems work, and you think that you can just do a hard stop on something by, say, not having a pipeline, then you don't totally understand what the issue is to begin with, right? So you're kind of shadowboxing. At the same time, it's sort of like, and coming from Alberta, there's a lot of people, my neighbors, who feel like people who are climate activists or from BC don't understand sort of the economic realities of Alberta. And there's an element of truth there too. So all of these things can be true at once. I think the reality is, the thing that I always look at, so I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I think that we spend a lot of time in our society, and social media has amplified this, of trying to be against something. We want to stop logging, we want to stop climate change, we want to stop Donald Trump, whatever. It's always stopping something. But it's not enough about what's the solution, what's the and, what's your better idea. And I think a big part of that is if we can challenge more people to be solution makers rather than problem pointer outers, then I think we've got a healthier discourse. And then from that, I think we start looking at, okay, well, maybe you can't solve climate change. But maybe what we can do, especially as a country like Canada, we can help protect biodiversity. We can do something rather than stop something. We alone as a nation, I don't think, and again, you're more well-schooled in the climate stuff, but I don't think that we as a nation can single-handedly even come up with the toolbox, let alone implement that to mitigate climate change. But we can go a long way with biodiversity, which can go a long way to helping climate change too, right? So I think that if we were in the habit of creating a citizenry that wanted to be part of the solution-making process, rather than the opposing business, of which a lot of our society is set up to do, right? Like that is the nature of opposition in government. It is the nature of how media works, black and white, us versus them. I mean, it's just the nature of the game. So how can we pivot the conversation? I don't know. I hope Nature Labs is part of that answer, but I don't pretend to have the complete answer or even 99.9% of the answer. So how do we find a way to turn our citizenry into a nation of solution makers? I mean, what do you think? Do you have an idea?
What a great question, Simon. We didn't rehearse this, I swear. And let me just reiterate that we will definitely open things up for questions and answers in a couple of minutes. So please keep track of your good questions. We'd love to get to them. But you're sounding an awful lot like one of my bosses. You may have heard of him, Mark Carney. And I have to say one of my bosses, because I have many. But I actually, occasionally I describe him as not so much my boss as my shift supervisor, but that gets like a different reaction from me. But the Prime Minister said this just earlier this summer, which was, received mixed reactions, I think, depending on the audience, but don't tell me what you're against, tell me what you're for. Yeah. And that's where I think we do see a lot of evidence of that ethos, of that mental attitude in the priorities that the government has set, which are, broadly speaking, about what it is we want to see, and obviously using the government's rhetoric, what we want to build in this country. And so, to point to what I think is one of the most important news stories of this government's, 18 months almost in office, but the announcement just earlier this week of the Churchill Falls hydroelectric project between Quebec and Newfoundland. That is what we want to see. That is massive scale, low carbon electricity being brought online in a way that is building off of the interests of the provinces involved, and is meaningfully going to increase the amount of low carbon energy that is available in this country and can therefore displace other more polluting, more high carbon forms of electricity. So that's a signature example of the Prime Minister's attitude towards these questions, which is we have to build the good stuff we want, not just stop building the bad stuff that some people don't want. And calling it bad stuff is obviously, I won't maybe name any specific projects in that, but this is where it's a positive vision about building the future we want to see, not just preventing certain outcomes we don't want to see in the future. And not everybody is in agreement with that, but you are, I think, channeling where the Prime Minister and the government, want us to go, which is doing the things that we know are going to continue to move us in the right direction.
I'll try to get an endorsement of me.
I'm the one talking about the PM. You can leave it if you choose.
No, I think. I mean, look. I think the private Simon Jackson, or the Simon Jackson who once ran the Youth Coalition. I think I've always been. My MO was probably always pragmatism, probably to a fault. And I know I made some people upset over the years. Pragmatism isn't easy, right? Like pragmatism, it requires its own. It's a perspective too, right? Like everything else. And I don't think there's necessarily one perspective that's right or another one that's wrong. I think I've learned that increasingly with my life. I think the challenge is that, and this is my only sort of small pushback to the Prime Minister, is that while I think broadly speaking, obviously a lot of Canadians agree with that and are working towards it, and I appreciate that he's stealing the lingo from Nature Labs, which came out several years before he made the speech to stand for something, not against something. I'm pretty sure he's still actually from Donna Friesen from Global News, but anyways, I think at the end of the day though, people's idea of what is good differs, right? And I think that's the challenge. And so how can you still find spaces to have robust debates between provinces, between communities within provinces, between peoples within provinces who have different visions of good and who all have legitimate points, right? And I think that we've sort of entered into this era of grievance politics, and obviously America's gone down that path to a much more, to a much greater degree, and we're seeing the impacts of that. I am extremely worried that while we're doing a great job of patting ourselves on the back and saying we're not America, we're getting close. Like, I still see that division. I still see that poisonous polarization. I see it especially, in my neighborhood. I see it, the sovereignty debate brings that out. So I think, I will say that I appreciate where the Prime Minister is going with this. I appreciate these great projects. But I also recognize that Churchill Falls, which I personally think is a great opportunity, and the kind of agreements that we have to do as a country, I also recognize it's going to take up a ton of land, it's going to hurt biodiversity on the ground. And so then how are you making these choices of, this bear lives here and that bear doesn't live here, or whatever? I go to bears always because I'm a bear guy, right? but I think these are the kinds of questions we've got to realize there is no clean decision, there's no perfect answer, and at a time like this we're going to have to get better at having complex conversations with people we dislike more frequently, and still coming to an answer fast. And I think that's the only thing, is that how can we not skate past or skate ahead of tough conversations while still trying to move quickly, because we obviously have to. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. And I think I looked at tomorrow's event, say, on that panel you listed everybody who's there. And I think we're all probably conspicuous by the absence we know who's not there, right? And I think that's a concern. But I also think and again, this is not a criticism for tonight, it may be a light criticism about tomorrow, is that partisanship matters. Working together matters with people who are like-minded, absolutely. I obviously believe that. I ran an organization for 20 years that had a very distinct perspective. But I think that, if a Victoria Forum is a place that, say, and I'm not speaking to our panel, but to the Victoria Forum as a whole, is a venue that maybe conservatives don't feel comfortable at, that's a concern. Now, is that a reflective of conservatives? Absolutely. But it's also a reflection of that they don't feel comfortable. As many people probably in this room wouldn't feel comfortable, say, at the Manning Conference, right? And so why is that? And I think we all got to start doing a better job of finding commonalities, I'm sorry to say but as liberals, how can you talk to more conservatives in Alberta? How can more conservatives in Alberta talk to liberals in Victoria? How can we have these conversations as Canadians without demonizing one another, recognizing that some believe, and some rightly believe, that there are some communities that do more demonizing than others. But at the end of the day, how do we have these tough conversations quickly and recognize that in pursuit of good, recognizing that everyone's vision of good is not the same. And how do you have that tough conversation? Fast.
Well, perhaps the most partisan thing that I'll say tonight, let the record show that multiple conservative officials were invited to participate in our panel tomorrow, and they all declined, so you may take of that whatever you will. It's not for a lack of attempting to include all colleagues from all sides of the aisle in that discussion. But let's talk...
It's absolutely no criticism of you. I think it's a reflection of where we're at, right?
And I don't even know that it's a criticism of those individual members of parliament whom I won't name.
And I totally agree.
I think it speaks to the, and I won't name them, but I think it speaks to the broader decisions being made by the forces that be in that movement and in that party. But this
That's a concern.
Totally, 100%. But what I want to pick up on, Simon, is you used one of the magic words of our times, pragmatism, and I want to pick up on that and put on my local MP hat for a moment and channel some of what I hear from constituents and what I hear from people in Victoria certainly, but from elsewhere in BC, about or directed towards our Albertan neighbours, and to the extent that you'd like to respond to it, not that you need to defend all Albertans, Alberta, or the government of Alberta, but how this would land with you, because it's something that I think will probably resonate with many folks in this room. And that's this language of pragmatism, this word of we have to be pragmatic, we have to be realistic, is often used, in my experience and that of other British Columbians and folks on the South Coast, as a weapon against people who express concern about a pipeline or about fossil fuels or about, generally speaking, humans' negative impacts on the environment that we rely on. And so, well, you have to be pragmatic. You can't shut it down tomorrow. We need the economy to function. People need jobs. All of which is true. Government needs revenues, also very true. But where I think there's a source of frustration that I would commiserate with is when we are being told that it's pragmatic to support the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure, it's pragmatic to do X or Y, but it's not available for us to say that in the context of climate change, maybe it's not pragmatic for the government of Alberta to impose a moratorium on renewable energy production, right? Like, that's not pragmatic. That wasn't a business decision. That was an ideological decision used to disrupt the energy transition. Well, that doesn't sound very pragmatic to me, and it certainly doesn't sound very free market if you're into that kind of thing, which I'm under the impression conservatives pretend to be. That's the most partisan thing I'm going to say. Let me correct myself. But I mean this very seriously, right? Because it's not that we don't have tools available for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's not that we don't know what to do. And that's true of the government of Alberta, the government of British Columbia. That's true of anybody, frankly, who knows how to Google and read, right? Because this is not a new issue. We know what the problem is. We know what the solutions are. We're having trouble really implementing those, but that's not a knowledge problem, right? That's a values problem or a resources problem or however we want to frame it. But pragmatism gets used, it seems, really only on the side of fossil fuels. And that is frustrating when it's pragmatic regardless, or it's argued to be pragmatic, regardless of what the context or the circumstances surrounding it may be. So let me use a couple of just generalized examples. But let's say that the global price of oil is down, which of course makes it less economical for us to invest in fossil fuels and develop new fossil fuels. Oh, well, the global oil price is down, so government needs to step in to help boost this sector and keep it viable. Okay, the oil price is massive and it's through the roof and it's $110 a barrel. Well, look, it's so profitable. Obviously, it's pragmatic of us to allow private sector to develop this industry. It's pragmatic as long as it's good for the extraction of fossil fuels in the province of Alberta. That's not what pragmatism means. That's not what that word actually means, right? So it gets, I think, utilized very selectively. And in the context of our recent debates, I would say we feel that it's been used as a bit of a bludgeon often to say that, well, this is something that has to happen regardless of the many arguments that are mobilized against it. And I'm not saying that we need to be against it. I'm not saying the government's against it. We know that's not the case. But when people in British Columbia on the South Coast or on the North Coast said, well, I have a business that actually relies upon the coastal waters to still be clean and supportive of seafood, or clean and supportive of tourism, or I'm concerned about what the knock-on impacts of doing this will be for the agricultural lands that a pipeline has to go through. None of that gets read as pragmatic. Pragmatic is code, in this context, for what is good for, it has to be said, the wealthiest and most powerful industrial sector in this country's history. Hardly the underdog, right? Pragmatism is kind of thin rule, I feel a lot, in the way that it's utilized, not in what I think it maybe should be, which is much more compromise-oriented and consensus-oriented.
You're putting me in the awkward spot of being Alberta's defender. Okay. Look, I see this through as partly again why we started Nature Labs, is that I think that there's. I'll start with this. I think words matter, right? And I think words matter. And for a very long time, we've been careless with our use of words, and I think that how we say things and the words that we use to do it, and let's just say, for example, in Nature Labs, we took two examples, actually out of your interview, foreign funded radical and tar sands. The environmental movement using the phrase tar sands was extremely disrespectful to people who work there. Yes, recognizing the word originated in the oil patch, but they see it as dog whistle politics, as anti-oil. And foreign funded radical, as you so eloquently put to students, was dog whistle politics to try to shut down debate and having a healthy democratic conversation on important national issues, right? And so those words used by different factions of our society, I think, is partly why we're here now today. I think whether who's more right or more wrong, I mean, that's a debate. I'm not sure it's a particularly helpful one, but I do think that you're right. I think I think how we've talked about it for a long time has driven ourselves into the corners that have allowed this to happen. I know that people in Alberta, I think, see BC as not listening to them, not understanding their grievances, not putting themselves in their shoes, not recognizing that retraining can't happen quickly, feel that the person who owns the pizza store in Edson is going to be affected by what happened that doesn't happen in the oil patch. There's grievances that go back to provincehood and the fight for resource rights. They feel that Canada, and the irony here is that we point out in Nature Labs, is that a lot of what's discussed as Alberta grievance politics, let's just say, I'm summarizing, but broadly speaking, is there are parallels, and I emphasize this lightly, parallels to grievances other communities have. Some of those grievances are worse, or older, or more problematic, but they're similar things. They're fear of loss of culture, fear of a lack of people understanding their truth, or how they see the truth, right? And I think these conversations, when it doesn't happen, and then loaded words get thrown into the mix, it becomes a bit of a Molotov cocktail, and then pragmatism uses, anything gets used to shut down debate. That's one part of it, as I see it. The second part of it, as I see it, is the environment's always a political loser. Ironically, I remember it was Robert Kennedy Jr., yes, that Bobby Kennedy Jr., who taught me as a kid that the present shouts and the future whispers. That was his line, and he was right about the environment. Ironically, again, but the reality is the economy and humans as a species are always going to be looking out for what can be done tomorrow. So pragmatic will always default to their reality. The spirit bear was an obvious thing, yet I was labeled as an enemy of BC in the front page of the paper. I had death threats as a teenager. I had, never in a million years did I think I'd be driving from Cochrane to Vancouver and seeing spirit bears on every third license plate of a car. It's profoundly weird. It shows it can happen, but it shows how long that culture shift takes, right? And I think because the economy is always so immediate and everyone's always more worried about, the roof over their head and the food on the table, that as liberal Don Lovett told Nature Labs, that issue is always going to go away in economic conditions like we have today. I don't think it's right. I absolutely think you're right. So, for example, for me, I get frustrated because Alberta's not taking action, say, on the climate. Insurance companies sure as heck don't care whether they are or not. Someone's paying the bill, and it ain't going to be them. So it's me. So my insurance bill for a tiny townhouse in Cochrane, Alberta, has gone through the roof. I now pay more in insurance in a year than I paid in rent just before COVID in Calgary. That's insane. But that is a direct parallel to the lack of pragmatism on the environment and recognizing that it's an economic issue. That's an opinion, but that's also my reality. And so I find that absolutely it's a pragmatism issue, but we don't package it as that. And because the environment isn't that kind of top of mind, omnipresent, Sashi Curl told us in Nature Labs, I think it was a good point, the pollster was Angus Reid. She said, if there's not a picture of it, it's not real to people. And climate's increasingly getting a picture, but it might almost be too late. The question I have is, does biodiversity have a picture? And the biodiversity crisis have a picture? And what that can do? And can that be done before it's too late? Because to me, it's even a bigger issue. So I think these are the kind of challenges we have to ask. How can we create the picture to make it more real? How can we make the issue something that is a pragmatic issue, like my insurance bill saying, but also at the same time, how can it be done by having conversations that don't use the kind of language that says everybody to their corners, that lets them default to using things like pragmatism as a punching bag to deflate environmental arguments. I just think that, I think it comes down to respect. How can you show each side of a debate, whether you agree or disagree, viscerally? How can you show respect and listen and ask questions and have hard conversations and really hear why Monty Selberg thinks this all goes back to resource rights and provincehood with Alberta and an F-18 deal in Winnipeg in the 80s? Because that's where he thinks a lot of this frustration comes from. But the man's an environmentalist. So how do you square that circle? How do you bring these people together to have these conversations again? Because they're not on the same page at all. I think that's the question. So which is not really an answer, I guess. So maybe that's actually my answer. We need to start asking more questions. We need to start having more conversations, and I think we've got to be more respectful in the process. We're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. Hell, if I haven't already underlined this before, I made a lot of mistakes. I put a lot of solutions on the table that were imperfect, that hurt people, that disappointed people. I could have done it a lot better. We all could. We're all human. We all do our best. But we've got to do better, and we've got to do better faster because of that. That's my take.
I have one more comment maybe, and then we can start to get some questions if you're ready for that. But what that quotation from Sashi Curl made me think of, if you can't take a picture of it, it's not real, is a quote that I don't know who to attribute it to because I saw it on the internet like so many things, but it feels truer and truer with each passing season, which is that, and I paraphrase only a little bit, climate change is increasingly going to manifest as a series of videos that other people have taken on their phones until you're the one taking the video of it on your phone.
Yeah.
And it's something that, frankly, our new wildfire reality has really brought home for me. The fires recently that burned Summerland and part of the area around Kelowna, there were people who had lived in Victoria who had since moved to that community, who were friends of friends, who were only 1 degree separation removed from me, who lost their home, who lost their farm, and who filmed themselves in the process of losing their farm. And I have to say, to see the video of people who are known to me as real human beings, not abstract random strangers on the internet, doing precisely what that unknown, unattributed, statement would suggest was really very sobering for me. And it's where this discussion of pragmatism is so interesting, because it has, I think, a bit of an uneasy relationship with the distinct but perhaps related concept of realism. And I fancy myself to be a climate realist. People occasionally, not so often anymore because I take it poorly, but I've been accused of being an idealist. And I don't think that's a fair characterization of my beliefs. I think I'm actually a climate realist. A climate idealist is someone who doesn't think that climate change is happening. That's the idealistic thinking around climate change. Conversely, a climate idealist is somebody who thinks that there is a switch or a silver bullet that we can just invoke and somehow fix this problem overnight. That's idealistic in the extreme. That's not. Climate realism is the realistic recognition that this is most definitely happening. It's happening because of our own activities, our own behaviors, our own practices and systems. And these are the things that we can do about it, but not all at once, not overnight, and probably not without having to fight about it a while first, right? Climate realism is a label that I like because I think we have to be realistic. As I've said to many people, I don't meet too many climate deniers in this community, but I do meet them occasionally. Maybe they sense me and they come out of the woodwork. But climate change cares about you, whether or not you care about climate change. Climate change will burn down your house, even if you're denying it's happening, right? That's climate realism to me. And so I want us as a country, and I want us as a government and as a community to be rooted in realism. Realism when it comes to the problem, the very real urgency of the problem, and realism about the solutions that are available, but as I say, can't be magicked into existence. We don't have a magic wand that we can wave and put this thing back in the bottle, right? So pragmatism versus realism, I think, is kind of an interesting frame there, but it's coming for us regardless.
Well, I think there's one other piece to that. So, I think it's a really good point. And I think you're absolutely right. We all got to be more realistic about everything. Economics, environment, what's happening down south, how that can affect us, how it could affect us in ways we still don't understand yet, right? These are all the things we've got to be realistic about. I think we're also living in an era where fact has been diminished, right?
Yeah.
And that maybe is the most central issue for everything we've been dancing around today, is that fact isn't fact anymore. And we don't have a trusted arbiter of fact.
Yeah.
And we've all contributed to, whether we realize it or not, there's been a lot of contributions to dismantling of the apparatus that was the arbiter of fact. Whether it was good or not, or perfect or not, is an open debate, that's fair. But now that it's gone, we've lost control of fact. That's a big problem. How do we wrangle that back in? I don't know. Now, one other point I wanted to make that I learned through the Spirit Bearer years, to kind of bring us full circle, is the slight difference between compromise and balance. And to me, as you were kind of pointing out the difference between pragmatism and realism, I kind of see the same thing. Compromise we see sort of as this great Canadian value that we kind of rush, and sorry, again, I realize this is a partisan room and centrist, but we kind of all rush to the middle to make that compromise. But sometimes the best solution isn't necessarily in the middle. Maybe one solution is better more to the right, or more to the left, or whatever. But at the end of the day, what I like is balance, in that we're not trying to get that 50+1 middle of the road compromise that leaves some people feeling out in the cold who might eventually want to separate from the country. How do we get to a place where we try to take maybe a little bit more time to find a little bit more nuance to kind of create those asymmetrical solutions that can work for someone in Victoria, in Clem2, in Cochrane, in Hanna, Alberta? How do we get to a place where we can find something better than the compromise, that slightly more innovative balance that still is, in essence, a compromise, but goes beyond 50+1 and gets us to maybe that 70 or 80% plurality of a solution? And to me, that often just comes down to creativity. And that comes back to critical thinking. And how do we get more of us to be critical thinkers, especially in a factless era? That's the question I have.
Well, that's a great segue, because I know we're in a room full of critical thinkers right here. So really happy to open up the floor to comments. And I did see a very patient hand in the back of the room. So we will repeat your question here. So feel free just to shout it out, please, as briefly as you can make it, but go for it.
A couple of aspects. One part for Simon and one part for
Can't hear.
We'll repeat it in a moment. She's just going to say the question.
Other than biodiversity, Simon, what other possible and not lofty dreams, changes do you see that need to take place other than biodiversity to help the situation where we're at this point in time in terms of the climate? That's number one. Number two, from that, what aspects of those has the Liberal Party looked at putting into policy, or have they not looked at and won't be considering? Where are they at in terms of those, just practical? I'm not asking for a full dream of let's change climate change. And also, if you could fill us in after that, number three, Will, was the pipeline decision, like the behind the scenes somewhat, was it a sellout? Was it something to appease Alberta? I think we need to understand a little bit more like where that came from. Is there aspects of it we need to accept? Why did that come about? And I guess you can't tell us if you think it really is going to come about the pipeline, or if it was a maneuver that needed to be made at a certain point in time, because we're dealing with, as you said, many situations going on around us, politically, economically.
Nice, easy questions to get us started. Thank you so much for those. Appreciate it. Simon, if you want to just restate the question around biodiversity that you're answering, and then I'll take it.
So other than biodiversity, what are the things you see, Simon? Could be implemented that aren't pipe, that aren't so total dreams?
And the question basically is how can we tackle climate change, that tangible things that Canada could or should be doing to tackle climate change other than biodiversity, correct?
How do we what?
How do we tackle climate change other than biodiversity as a nation? What are the tangible things we can do as a country? Well, I do think Churchill Falls is one of those obvious kinds of projects. It rose in the right direction of the other challenges that we're doing. So how can we upscale big, major projects? What I call it the systems level projects that can have a massive impact on a host of fronts quickly. Churchill Falls is a great example.
I'm asking you as a non-liberal.
No, I'm not a liberal, and that's just a genuine answer. I think that's, and look, I have some again, as I said earlier, Site C in BC as an example, right? Think of the area that was flooded and the impact that had on biodiversity. But was it, is that the kind of project we need to have as a net good for climate change? These are the tough questions, the tough trade-offs that are going to have to be happening. I'm not sure I'm totally, again, I have a nonpartisan, public persona. I ask questions, but I have opinions. And so I haven't looked into Churchill Falls enough to know what are all the areas that will be impacted. What is the impact going to be on the Newfoundland marten, say? It's an endangered species. These are questions that I have, that I don't have the answers to yet, but I would look into in making my final decision of whether I think it's an overall net good just on the environment's sake. But I think those are kind of projects that we probably need to do in upscale. Nuclear is obviously one of them. It's extremely controversial. But we have to make tough choices, and is nuclear the kind of thing that needs to happen that Canada could do? We have uranium, we have seemingly the will now. Is that the kind of project that we should be pursuing? Maybe that's another piece in the toolbox. I do think, I'm going to belabor this a little bit, but I do think it's going back to try to find ways for tangible local action. I think, you said it in our interview, it's a cliche, as you said at the time, but it's true. And I'm going to echo your words for underscoring.
I love being quoted it myself.
But change really begins at the local level, and that's where the action's at. That's what he said, and he's right. The action is there, and so how do you not just incentivize people, but how do you make people feel hope again? How do you make them feel like small, tangible, personal actions can add up to something bigger? So is there a national framework where individual action can actually add up to something at scale? The challenge we have here is that so often solutions are not at scale. And so how do we add something up? So I still think individual action matters. I think individual action has died off. I think people are giving up. And I think young people are completely just turning the page. So how do you get them back engaged to making those actions, and how can you show that they can be tangibly add up to scale? I think that's the third thing that comes to mind off the top of mind that can make a real big impact for climate in Canada that we can do as a nation. But I know you said and other than biodiversity, but I gotta hammer this point. The best tool we have to slow down climate change is protecting biodiversity, and particularly forests. And I realize I've got a bit of a past bias with that. That's fine, you can disagree with me. And anyone watching, students listening can disagree with it. But I do think that forests and biodiversity is one of our best tools for combating climate change, as well as slowing down climate change to help biodiversity. And on top of which I would say, biodiversity is a very misunderstood subject. And a lot of what we try to do for biodiversity ends up trying to, and certainly I would say this was more true of, say, the previous government than the current government, was trying to tick a lot of different boxes, maybe social justice boxes, rather than looking at necessarily what was the top issue for biodiversity. Biodiversity, what matters is making sure we're protecting the right areas for biodiversity. So making sure that if we're going to do biodiversity well, and because we have the best chance of doing it for the world, as also you said in our interview, that it's our responsibility as global stewards to protect biodiversity. How do we make sure we're doing it in the right way? And how are we making sure we're doing it in the right way that also helps climate? So I still think that, as much as you asked other than biodiversity, I still think that we're not getting the biodiversity piece right yet, and we need to. So those are my ideas. For whatever they're worth. Feel free to disagree.
No, that's great, Simon. Well, it's a great segue because the federal government is fully aligned with what Simon was just saying about biodiversity being one of the most important tools that we have at our disposal. Protect biodiversity, and you are meaningfully helping to address climate change. So the high-level response to what the government's doing on this, which I'm happy to share, happy to reiterate, is actually maintaining a commitment that was made under Prime Minister Trudeau, so it's not new. It was 21, I think, was the commitment was made. There's a global biodiversity target, it's often called the 30 by 30 target, where countries that have signed on commit to conserving 30% of their land and water areas to protect biodiversity. And so for small countries, I mean, it's always a large share of your total area, but for small countries, it's not necessarily all that much area. For Canada, 30% of our land mass is a meaningful part of the Earth's surface, right? It's a large area. And so this is a target that was already set under the previous Prime Minister and has been reiterated and maintained. And in fact, we've increased the amount of government funding going towards meeting the 30 by 30 targets. So Canada has already conserved around 16-17% of our area, so we're more than halfway towards meeting that target. But but obviously it's not, I hate to say it, 2030 is not that far away. It's shocking.
And we've been at 70% for a very long time.
And so, but this is where the government has made meaningful progress already. So Simon has spoken today about his experience with the Great Bear Rainforest. One of the announcements that the federal government made just in the last few months was the conservation of the Great Bear Sea, essentially the water directly off of the Central Coast, which has now been conserved, consistent with our 30 by 30 targets, but also, as folks will know if they're familiar with Haida Gwaii, if they're familiar with the incredible ecological richness of BC Central Coast. To Simon's point, it's a very meaningful area to conserve. It's an area that meaningfully advances our environmental goals by conserving it in a way that not all area is actually created equal. So we have further to go. The government's committed to it. This is going to be something we will continue to announce in the next 3 years to meet that target. And we're hopeful, by which I mean me and many of my BC colleagues, that British Columbia will play a really large role in helping to meet that target, because BC has this extraordinary ecological diversity and richness in our province that we can conserve in a way that's going to serve us well, serve our communities well, serve our economies well, and help the government actually achieve that target. I'll be very brief, but the government has had a number of strategies released in the last year, so many that it's a bit hard to keep them straight sometimes. But the signature around environmental policy was called the Nature Strategy, A Force for Nature. And so it was released this year and has a number of different things in it, but also puts almost $3.5 billion on the table to fund those things. So the federal government is putting its money where its mouth is as far as meaningfully funding the conservation work that is necessary to meet that target, necessary to maintain good ecological health, and necessary to help conserve biodiversity and address climate change.
Can I ask one really important point, because this relates to the pipeline stuff, is that Alberta has come out against that nature strategy. Right? The Alberta government is not on side with that. They're also on side with overturning poison that is federally regulated, which impacts biodiversity in a very significant way. These are all the kind of issues that I think that Alberta needs to see, is the give and take of having a country, and BC needs to see too, right? So, if we're going to build a pipeline to the West Coast, maybe into the United States again, who knows what's going to go on next week. But I think if that's the kind of thing we can get, sort of, is the give on one side, is the take on the other side. Maybe Alberta finds a way to come on board with, say, the nature strategy, or around pesticide use that impacts biodiversity. These are the kind of questions. If one province feels like they weren't getting enough out of Confederation for a very long time, and now is getting everything from Confederation, while BC and their values are not respected, as a British Columbian, that would make me upset. And it's not going to be too far down the path that we're not going to see, I'm not going to say sovereignty movements, but we're going to see that kind of regional divisions cropping up in a lot of different areas. So how can we find a way and decide what we can give for the economy, that for Alberta's understanding and their economic interests, and where maybe can they give a little bit that represents BC's values or Ontario's values, who are very, very high on that nature strategy. It's a question that I have, and I think that it's important to keep that in mind, that none of these things happen in a vacuum, right? And so I think the nature strategy is really important, but it's not a fait accompli that Alberta is going to go along with it. So how did that all get squared to, right? Yeah. How do you think?
Well, let me pivot away from that and back to the pipeline question that I was asked as well. And to be clear, you used the phrase inside the room or behind the scenes. And in this sense, I'm not behind the scenes, right? I'm not in the room when the Prime Minister and Premier Smith are making discussions around pipelines or anything else for that matter. So I have certain access, but it falls short of being in the room for those decisions. What I will say about the rationale that the Prime Minister and the government have for putting this project forward for consideration by the Major Projects Office is really two very fundamental and quite obvious to everybody here things that have changed in the last 18 months compared to previously. The first of those is very much the fact of the re-election of President Trump and what that has immediately meant for our trading relationship with the United States. And please don't misunderstand me. Everything that I'm saying here is sharing with you an analysis of why a decision was taken. I'm not necessarily reflecting my own views or perspective on these issues, but trying to share why the decision is what it is. And we really can't, overstate how serious it is for our country and our economic well-being to be in an escalating trade war as we are with the United States. And obviously that has gotten worse, unfortunately, in the last 48 hours. So this is an evolving issue and a moving target. But it was evident from before Donald Trump had even taken office, right, for the second time, that he was committed to continuing to apply economic pressure to Canada. And so the pipeline, the idea of another export-oriented bitumen pipeline to the West Coast, the reason that that project is supported by the federal government at this time over other projects potentially that would send out primarily Alberta, bitumen to, for example, the United States, because that would deepen our dependence on the American market, and a West Coast export pipeline will help to reduce our dependence on the American market. So from an economic lens, it is very literally about creating more capacity for this country to withstand the economic aggression that is being inflicted on us by the United States. And if one wishes, we can distill that down to money, right? That is about Canada being able to be economically productive, for governments to be able to, have revenues coming in, for us to being able to sell a commodity on the international market in a way that will make it harder for our neighbor and biggest trading partner to extort us in the way that they have been attempting to do. So that's a major part of the rationale, and obviously is something that has shifted, right? There wasn't this discussion in the same way under the Biden administration because we didn't have a hostile administration at that time. The second piece, though, that has shifted and that the Prime Minister and the government are responding to is, to a certain extent, the elephant in the room. It is the question of Alberta separatism. It is the, I think, quite incontrovertible fact that there are political actors in this country and in the province of Alberta that are seeking to use this, flare-up of separatist sentiment and resentment against Ottawa as a lever to extract political concessions from the federal government. There are people who are threatening to break up Canada in order to get what they want. It's that simple. I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to point fingers, but we could have a very interesting conversation once the cameras are off and everybody puts their phone in the middle of the room so I know no one's recording about who's behind that. But it's very clear that's what's happening. And so any Prime Minister, or I should say every Prime Minister that we've ever had, has to set priorities and has to make, challenging, trade-offs between different priorities that reflect different regional economies, different values, potentially different cultures to some extent. This Prime Minister is having to make decisions that really do directly impact the future integrity of the country as a whole. And he's not the first Prime Minister to have that burden, but it also hasn't happened all that frequently, right? Only really 2 previous prime ministers have had to deal in an organized, high-level way with a separatist referendum threat that could have torn apart the country. One of those was Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, and the other was Jean Chrétien, and they both saw off the threat of Quebec separatism at those times in 1980 and 1995. It's often been said, though, that the highest priority of any prime minister will always and should always be national unity. That keeping the country together is, in fact, the highest obligation that a Prime Minister has. And as uncomfortable as I am ranking or ordering very, very pressing, urgent issues like climate change and national unity, but nonetheless, I think we can get around to recognizing that our fight against climate change would be much less effective if the country broke apart. Our ability to reduce our emissions will be compromised if we have a gaping hole in the middle of the nation. Just as even the discourse around Alberta separatism has, I think, contributed quite negatively to our national discourse and has unfortunately, compromised some of the good things that we could be doing if we were collaborating, instead of, to some extent, engaging in this game of veiled threats and, potential repercussions. So this is what has happened. This is what has changed in the context around the proposed pipeline. And the Prime Minister is responding to those changing circumstances in the way that he has judged best for the country overall. Supporting a project that will increase the the fiscal capacity and economic resilience of the country and the federal government that will hopefully help to mollify and make Albertans feel better seen and heard within the Federation. And specifically, let me name the thing, seen and heard by a federal Liberal government that they have in the recent past seen as being antagonistic to their interests, right? The Prime Minister is a son of Alberta. The Prime Minister is a proud Albertan. He identifies as an Albertan. It causes him tremendous discomfort to contemplate Alberta separatism, surging and potentially causing the rupture of the country under his watch. And he's committed to keeping the country together and to keep us moving forward as Canadians and as Canada in the direction that we want to go in, which is reducing our emissions and adapting to climate change. But there are these other factors that are constraining the freedom of action potentially available to him to do that. And I'll stop there. That was what we did.
No, that's right.
Okay. We've got some other wonderful hands up. Maybe we'll start at the back and we'll work our way forward. So you, sir, the black vest, yes.
I just felt it's rather interesting that the Albertans want to separate, but Quebec has stated that they will not have anything to do with separation until Trump is out of office. Which I think shows something about the attitude of Alberta.
Yeah.
There are very interesting parallels to be drawn between the provinces of Quebec and Alberta at this juncture in time. What else can I say about this? It's not going to get me in trouble.
What is the question?
I think there are, look, I think every story has parallels. That's what I started alluding to earlier, right? Like, there's similarities between Alberta and Quebec, and there's not. There's similarities between some Indigenous grievances as well as Alberta grievances in terms of like culture loss and fear, and obviously with varying degrees of scale. These things are, there are parallels if you want to draw them, but they're also very different too, right? And Quebec has its own very rich and deep history. I'm not sure I'd go so far as saying Quebec is taking one for the team here. I think that has a lot more to do with politics and provincial politics in an election that's really tight, and how the riding vote breaks down in Quebec. I don't think that there's more or less altruism in Alberta than there is in Quebec, or there is in BC, or there is in any other part of the country. I think every part of this country, look, we're a big country, right? We're a massive country. We are in many ways like 13 mini countries, but our strength is being united. And I think at the end of the day, we do have our regional differences. We do have our regional values. I do have a value that comes from being born on the West Coast that is different from my friends who were born in Cochrane, Alberta. But I don't think that it makes my values more important than their values. I just think that it makes them different. And how some people, again, I sort of alluded to this earlier during the Spear Bear years, right? Like, I think you can, after a while, it's easy to be sucked into the rabbit hole of anger and bitterness and disappointment and all those horrible human emotions that are also just very human, right? You can feel betrayed and frustrated and disappointed and feel like things are just stuck. And that can manifest itself in ugly ways at times. And we are all, I don't think it's an Alberta problem. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I am defending Alberta here. I don't think that Albertans as a whole are bad Canadians, and I don't think that their grievances should be lightly tossed aside where we say Quebec's are more important or whatever. And I know that's not quite what you're saying, but I do think that anger can manifest itself in weird ways at weird times. And this is a weird time, and we talked about the demise of fact, we've talked about the changing of the arbiter of our debates in society and how these things are happening. I think that's all part and parcel of this, as is culture, as is history, as are all these just layers of things that can lead to a really bad moment that sparks the powder keg. And I think that's what's happened in Alberta. And unfortunately, a series of events have allowed that powder keg to light. And this time in Quebec, that might not be the case. But that's probably just pure luck. And I have to say, as a British Columbian, there are times where I get really riled up about how BC is treated. Kim Campbell in our interview, she said, BC, I'm from British Columbia, we're the Rodney Dangerfield Confederation. We don't know respect. And she's right, and I feel that way sometimes. And I feel anger as a British Columbian how we're treated, even though I might not live here anymore. So I think we all are capable of feeling these emotions. We're all capable of feeling anger. It's just it's a question sometimes of just the luck of how circumstances come together, or lack thereof. That's my take.
Well, at the risk of picking fights, I guess I'll point out in the context of fact that one of the facts that I like to remind people about, because I think it's often overlooked in this discussion, is that as we speak, in the last week, in the last month, in the last 6 months, there has never been more oil and gas produced in the province of Alberta in its history, and there has never been more profit made from oil and gas produced in the province of Alberta in its history. So that's take it or leave it. They want more, some people want less, but as a matter of fact, Albertans are the wealthiest Canadians, the most prosperous Canadians, and that sector, which we hear rather a lot about in terms of how hard done by they've been, has never been doing better. And I think that those are relevant facts that are not perhaps often reflected on. But the key answer, I think, to your question, sir, would be that the Parti Québécois wants to win an election in Quebec, and separatism is unpopular in Quebec, so they're promising not to force people to separate if they vote for them in the fall, and it's a very specific tactical move that that party is making for their own interests.
Yeah.
Let's get some more questions. Linda.
I've heard tonight a million questions, but I'd like to know, and what I heard was there's a lot of complaints but no answers. But I'd like to know what's being done to generate answers. Is the Victoria Forum, are there workshops, are there think tanks, are there, what's happening?
No answers to what, Linda? Can you?
To all the questions that your colleague has asked about, how do we have a division? So sorry. All the different issues that he's brought up, and he's brought up many questions through the whole.
I'm a question answer now.
I know exactly, but are there workshops? Are there policy forums that people can contribute to? Where are the answers coming from?
Yeah.
Or is anyone trying to come up with answers and operationalize them?
I mean, I think that is that.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, sorry. The question is how do you operationalize, or how do we stop just asking questions, and how do we actually start coming up with answers, and where are the answers coming from? I think that is the question. I think it's so okay. So to your very specific point, is the Victoria Forum the place where the answers will be created? Look, I have a personal opinion. This is just mine. This is not a slight on who's going to be there, which will obviously include the two of us. But I question if whether solutions are going to come from, or the best solutions are going to come from a place that is going to be largely, at least 40% of the electorate doesn't feel comfortable being in that room. That's a concern that I have. The same can be said for the Manning Center, or fill in the blank, right? Like fill in the blank of another institution that are having these kinds of conversations. The concern that I have is that there are a lot of great forums and places in this country that convene hard conversations with interesting people. There's not a lot of forums that convene hard conversations with interesting people from all walks of life, including Alberta separatists, including conservatives, including liberals, including Indigenous, including different kinds of, different Indigenous communities who have differing perspectives, often on the same issue, right? Where do you bring together that full breadth of context? And as importantly, because you pointed out that the Victoria Forum is sort of the counterpoint to the Halifax Security Forum. Often when there are forums that bring together that wealth of diversity, it's still siloed into one subject field, right? So how do we make sure that we're talking about the environment at a security forum? How do we make sure we're talking about security at a more social forum, say Victoria? That's a question that I have. The answer to that, to me, is not readily apparent in the country. Parliament is obviously one place. That's what brings together people from all walks of life. Will is there to represent us, right? And so are everybody else. And as imperfect as Parliament is, it's still the best place we have to have those kind of conversations. Is it happening well enough or good enough? That's probably a question for Will. I'll turn it over in a second. But where else can it be? I think the answer is that's up to us, right? I remember when I was growing up, people were very critical of media. I was critical of the media. My father was in the media, and I criticized him endlessly. But but I will say that it is a reflection of us, right? So if we're not finding that venue, if we're not finding the places to have these conversations, to come up with these solutions, that's partially always going to be on us. How can we do a better job? How can we convene these conversations? We have tools now. It's easier to do. Not easy, but easier to do. For me, Nature Labs is my contribution to that. It's how can we make sure that young people have a seat at the table, it's their future that we're debating, how do we get them to, in my opinion, we spent a lot of time in high school, say, learning about this is the Canadian political system. Okay, how about you draft your better policy? What's your better idea? And draft a policy and put it forward, advocate for it. That's a much more comprehensive tool. You get to learn the system while also trying to be part of the solution and coming up with ideas. So I hope Nature Labs is an opportunity to not only raise the literacy levels on all of these important issues, most importantly our democracy, which I see to be increasingly fragile, but also at the same time empower young people to be solution makers right now. Ilona Doherty, who I believe is a cousin of yours or something, right? Isn't Ilona Doherty? No. Ilona Doherty, who's runs the Youth and Innovation Lab at the University of Waterloo. She's the leading thinker on young minds. And she's proven in science that between 18 and 25, we are at our peak creativity. And we are wasting that creativity by not engaging them in the process earlier. So I think that's my contribution to try to help engage those young creative minds earlier, get them thinking critically, acting more creatively. That's one piece of the puzzle. But how can we as citizens do a better job of convening or be participating in spaces that are true solution-making spaces? I don't think we have a lot of spaces that have what I'll call the credibility, rightfully or wrongly. We see boogeymen behind every closet and under every bed, right? We think that if in Alberta, we think that if you got money from the McConnell Foundation, that you're terribly left-wing. If you're in Vancouver and you get money from a corporation in Toronto, you're terribly right-wing. We've set people up to fail. So how do we destigmatize that? How do we stop seeing boogeymen behind every corner? How can we just get together as humans and start talking again? And I think we all have a role to play. But I do think Parliament's the most obvious place. Do you think it's going well?
Yeah. So here's what I'll say in answer to that, which is not going to be much of an answer, but it's the best I can give you now. But since we're citing kind of folks who've inspired us in this, there's an American sociologist named Dr. Tressie Cotton McMillan Cotton, and she said something recently that has really stuck with me, which is that there's no such thing as progress, there's only power. And she says that as a progressive person. She says that as a person who would like the United States to be very different than it is. But when we look back at major achievements of progressive politics, whether it's the women's movement, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the environmental movement, we have a tendency to call that progress, right? We did something and now we're there and it's better than it used to be, and so now we can move on to another issue. And then, shockingly, what happens to the state of women's rights in the United States? It gets rolled back. What happens to the state of civil rights in the United States? It gets rolled back. What happens to the state of the environmental movement in the United States? It gets rolled back. There was never progress. There was power, and for a while, those people, be they women, be they black people, African Americans, and people of color, or be they environmentalists, they seized power and they forced government to do what they wanted them to do. When they stopped holding on to that power, they let it dissipate. It's somewhere else now, and somebody else is using that to have their priorities enacted instead. So when I'm meeting with people, constituents, or activists or advocates around climate or energy or other issues, and they want to know why the government's not doing what they want it to do right now, I say, well, you're a person in my office, and it's lovely to speak with you. Do you have 1,000 friends who are going to join you in the streets on Saturday? Do you have 10,000 friends who are going to be on Parliament Hill next week? Do you have 1 million people marching in the streets of Canadian cities, as was happening on the issue of climate change in the fall of 2019? It should not be lost on anyone that this country made its most progressive climate and environmental policy decisions in history in the context of millions of Canadians demonstrating in the street for those changes. It's power. And right now, the folks who are advocating against some of what the government's doing are not exercising power. And I encourage them, I encourage everyone who wants to make that change to recognize that they need to actually have some juice to bring to that conversation and not just complain that things aren't the way we would like them to be. That's a naive approach to politics. I want to get another question in before we break. So we are getting
on this side.
I should come to this side, that's quite right. Let me say that I'm happy to stick around, and I think Simon's happy to stick around, but I'll take a question from this side. Sally, would you like to?
So,
Should I beg your pardon, sorry.
yes, I have heard you say the word climate change more than 100 times tonight, but I have not heard you talk about the Earth or the planet. And what we need to teach young people to do, and what all of us, is to fall in love with the planet. We need to fall in love with the Earth. We can't continue to keep damaging it. We can't keep polluting the air. We need to find the importance of trees in our existence. And we use the word nature, I believe, twice. But nature is everything. And nature is us. And we are swimming in plastic. And we know what to do about that. And we are breathing polluted air, and we know what to do about that. And there's no
What's the
right
question,
or
Patricia, so we
wrong
can
to
just
this.
respond to it, please? So you want us to know, to talk about what we can do more to stimulate that kind of affection
I
and
want us
relationship
to
to the
fall in
natural
love
world.
with the earth.
And that's great, but and I mean that seriously, that's an incredibly commendable and important vision, but this is kind of what I'm talking about politics and power, and I mean this in the most serious of senses. We cannot just be angry that the world is not the way we would like it to be if we expect it to change. We can be angry that it's not the way we would like it to be if that's all we want to do. Then that's fine, vent your spleen, it can feel good, you'll sleep better, but it's not going to get the change that you want in the world. That requires more. That requires organizing, and that requires engaging in real politics. So I mean this in the most serious of ways. If you're concerned about the planet writ large, shouting at and you're not doing this, but other people have done this, I am the Member of Parliament for Victoria, British Columbia, and there's no such thing as a government of planet Earth. It's not an object that we are going to be able to act on as real politicians trying to make decisions in this world. So I can make decisions, I actually can't make decisions, I'm not in a decision-making role, but I can advocate for decisions that are gonna serve my constituents, that are gonna serve this community, that are gonna serve the South Island, Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada. If I'm starting to advocate for things that are outside of this country, I will have constituents asking me why I'm wasting their taxpayer dollars doing that. And that doesn't mean they're right, but it does mean that that's one of the constraints that I have to operate in this role. And so I don't have the luxury of saying, well, this is what I want to do, regardless of what the people who elected me are expecting me to do. And that, scale that up for the government writ large. So I think you've touched on a really important point, Patricia. We know what the problems are. We know they don't start and stop at our borders. We know they're not specific to any one country, any one place. There's a reason why climate change is a global problem, and we talk about it as a global problem. But there isn't a global solution for climate change, I would suggest. And that's something that not every environmental politics scholar out there will agree with. But we did, in fact, try that. The global attempt to regulate and govern climate change is what the UNFCCC, for those of you who are familiar, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, attempts to do. And that was the principal, if not exclusive, focus of the global effort to combat climate change for 20 plus years, almost 25 years. And I regret to say that that system has fallen apart now. It functionally is not in existence. The UNFCCC, the multilateral regime to try to reduce our emissions collectively, it failed because people did not buy into it. Countries did not buy into it, citizens of those countries did not buy into it, and they punished the governments that wanted to make those decisions implemented in their own policies. They punished them, they threw them out, and they voted for somebody who wasn't going to talk about all that global climate stuff, but was going to talk about jobs and housing and healthcare and all those other issues. The constraint that politicians, especially elected ones, democratic ones, have to deal with is we can try to change people's minds. We can try to lead. We should try to lead. But you have to have people follow. You have to bring the people along. And I would suggest, and I will give you the microphone to respond, Simon, as well. I would say that this is the major failure of the previous Prime Minister's approach to climate change. Yes. An approach that I strongly supported at the time. Justin Trudeau brought me along on his government's approach to addressing climate change. But he obviously did not bring enough along Canadians. Did I say that right? Bring along enough Canadians. I think I got the order wrong there. I wish he had. I wish we had followed down that road. We didn't, and here we are as a result. So that's my response to that. I'll turn it over to Simon to give us.
Yeah, but that was a very valuable response.
Yeah, no,
What you said really mattered.
I'm glad. Thank you.
I think it is. I think that last point was what I was going to echo as well. I think there's two things. There's two things I want to say. First of all, I absolutely agree. We need to fall in love with our democracy, nature, our world, our neighbors. We have fallen out of love with reality. We have fallen out of love with the things that we should love. That is absolutely, you're absolutely right, that is central to everything. It's why I created Nature Labs. It's why it's called Nature Labs, right? Because I think nature is it's our common humanity. It's what can bring us together. It is what can break down barriers. I talked about earlier about the importance of words. The environment, rightly or wrongly, climate change, rightly or wrongly, is a word that is polarizing. Nature is something that can bring us together. It is our common humanity. It's why we use it as Nature Labs. It's why we use it to explain lessons as disparate as careers in art and science and social studies, because it is something that can bring us together. And I think to do that, you do have to make people fall in love again. You do have to see the beauty of a place like Mount Robson Provincial Park, where we center a lot of our stories. You do have to see the beauty of two bears and the magic of two bears that should be enemies working together and realizing that nature can teach us so much that we have forgotten. And then you got to see the beauty and the humanity of people like Will, people like Sashi Curl, people like Hal Kamisley, people like Hamish Marshall, people from all different walks of life who've got beautiful stories.
Well, if we don't, then
we're in trouble.
Then we're not there.
Absolutely. And that's it. So we have to find a way. So we have to find a way, I think, to fall in love with our neighbors, with our country, with nature, most certainly. I think it does start there. But I'll say the one other thing, and I think that point that you ended on is absolutely right. And that's that you have to bring people along with you. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have with the solutions we often create is that we forget that our neighbors have to live with it. And it's not just about getting the power, in my opinion. So the one thing I'd add on to that is that I think often when we amass power, when we have the chance to make decisions, that we don't move the needle so far one way or the other that we're encouraging the other side to rip it down the moment that they get their power. So how can we find a way to make sure that we are creating solutions that endure, creating lasting solutions? And I think that's, I hope, the real legacy of the Spirit Bear, is not just that the bear is protected or the land is, conserved as part of a, conservancy, but it's that at the end of the day, every third license plate in this province has a Spirit Bear on it. That more than 90% of British Columbians supported that last land use agreement. That was a forever agreement made by a small C conservative government. That shows you that if you can bring together a coalition around an issue like that, it's still possible to do that on big issues that matter. So how can we do that more often? That's the one great lesson to me from those days that we need to carry forward. How can we build coalitions that endure to make sure that when we don't have power, wherever side of the debate that we're on, that the other side isn't disrespecting us or ripping down what we worked hard to create. That's the thing. The last thing I'll say is that I think every single one of you are to be commended, because it's a Sunday night, it's hotter than the 80s in here, and you're all here supporting your community. I may not be a liberal, but I respect the heck out of all of you for your partisanship, for believing in the importance of democracy, for believing in the importance of good governance, realizing that good governance only happens when citizens contribute to the process, and you are all clearly doing that. But how do we do that more often? How do we work across partisan lines? That is a challenge. I hope Nature Labs is part of that solution. I think, as we all know, none of these things can happen in isolation. We all need to work together. We all need to help lift up one another. I need help. I'm sure you do too, and hopefully we can be there in the trenches together to make sure that our country stays sovereign, our nature stays healthy and sustainable for the next generation. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for your passion for our country, your commitment to democracy. Thank you for all that you do, whether I support or agree with you or not. I think it's a beautiful thing in this country. And you've got a wonderful MP here. He's a great, decent man. No matter what your politics is, he's one of the finest MPs I know, and a good friend. And a tremendous supporting friend.